Hi, my name's Edward and I wrote Line of Battle. In this video we're going to look at Brigade and Divisional level tactics used in the era of line warfare and how they're represented in the game. It's aimed at new players to help explain the scope of the rules as well as giving you some hints and tips to defeat your opponent, but it's also going to be useful for people who haven't seen the rules yet because it'll give you an idea of what the game's all about. So in this video we're going to look at tactics for infantry, cavalry and artillery and how to deploy your divisions on the tabletop. It'll cover which formations you need to use, how to use morale and cohesion to drive back your enemy and capture ground, and also how to inflict casualties. So let's get started. The first thing to talk about is the scope of these rules, what size battles they're supposed to represent. These games are big. Each one of these individual stands is a regiment, so you're talking about 600 to 800 men. And the whole division on the table is a couple of thousand. So this isn't a firefight or a skirmish. Each turn is about 20 minutes, so every time you roll a dice or take a morale check, you're actually representing big sweeping manoeuvres and whole chapters of a battle. The tactics that you need to think about when you play Line of Battle are momentum, timing, reserves on a large scale, not marksmanship and killing power like you need to think about on a smaller game. So what we've got here for the purposes of a demonstration is we've got a small Russian division here against a small Austrian division here. The forces are equal, but just for the purpose of this demonstration we'll show you a little bit about the mechanics of the game and how it works. So before we go into detail about the tactics, let's just run through what it is we're actually looking at here. So each one of these square bases represent either a battalion of infantry, a squadron of cavalry or a battery of guns. Now I've standardised the terms just to keep things simple, so they're all called regiments. Two or more regiments stuck together like this, that's a brigade, and the tray that you can see behind them holds their morale tokens and their casualty dice. That just tells you what sort of a state they're in. So the dice here will show you the number of hits they've got left, in this case 2. And the other is for the morale token, so a blue one there means those troops are disrupted. All these brigades that you can see represent one division, and they're all under the command of a general, who's this chap at the back. When we're playing a larger game on a bigger table, you probably have 4 or 5 divisions, quite a bit larger than this one, fighting together under the command of a marshal. But for the purpose of this demonstration, we've kept it simple with this small force. So, now that we know what we're looking at, let's talk about formations and infantry tactics. Infantry really are going to be the core of any battle that you fight, and they're going to be doing the brunt of the fighting. There's 2 main formations for your infantry and cavalry units to choose from. You've got line, which is side by side like these guys, and you've got column, which is one behind the other. What we're going to do now is run through the advantages and disadvantages of each formation so you can get an idea of when you'd need to use each one in a battle. For column formations, you can see that they will move faster, and it also allows you to snake around pieces of difficult terrain. For instance, you'd be able to just move nicely through this gap here. Remember that in Line of Battle, even if you glance some difficult terrain, you get a blue disrupted token, which is really going to affect you when you get into combat, so it's important to try and keep your troops fresh for as long as possible. On the other hand, the disadvantages are that you can't fire when you're in column, and you're also vulnerable to being enfiladed from the front. The only advantage of line formation is that it lets you fire. That's about it. Line formation is really slow, it's very unwieldy since you can only move to a 90-degree arc to your front and you can't reverse. It's a lot harder to avoid blundering into any difficult terrain, so you're more likely to end up with one of these blue disrupted tokens. Despite these disadvantages, you'll need to use line as your main formation once you're close, because it'll let you shoot at the enemy. So the headline is, use column to get close to the enemy nice and quickly, then get them into line once you're in range. but the precise timing makes the difference between victory and defeat. It takes a whole turn to change formation, so you need to time it properly, just like commanders really had to do in battles. If you do it too soon, you'll find yourself having to tortuously march forward in line to get into range of the enemy while you're under fire the whole time. If you do it too late, and you'll find the enemy's pouring fire into your column from the front and causing you really heavy casualties. You should try and aim to do your formation change just at maximum range when you approach the enemy. But you're never going to be attacking with just one brigade. You'll usually be attacking as part of a whole division, so the important thing is to learn how to use your troops to work together and what formations they need to be in order to defeat the enemy. So let's look at what we've got here. These infantry units are all in line over here, as is this artillery unit, and we've got this cavalry unit in column over here. What we really need to do is make sure that when we're attacking, we've got some units at the front here. These are in line, so they're able to fire, and then a unit behind in reserve. Now, what formation you put them in is up to you. I'm going to put these ones in column here so that they can quickly move to reinforce whichever formation needs it, whichever one gets into more trouble. The other thing to remember is your push in reserves ability. This is a special ability that your general gets, and what it does is it lets you move disrupted tokens and other morale tokens around in the division. So for instance, say if this division at the front took a casualty, so they go down to 3 hits, and then they fail their morale check, so they get a blue disrupted token. Provided your general is close enough, he can use his push in reserves ability to take the disrupted token and put it onto your reserves. That represents you moving fresh troops from this unit to this unit, and then this unit taking some time to refresh its troops, collect more water and ammunition and that sort of thing. So the important thing is not to have everything in the front line, otherwise you'll have nowhere for your general to stick these tokens. If you have one unit at the back which is constantly resting and getting rid of these bad morale tokens, you'll make sure that these two at the front can keep on fighting for as long as possible and push the enemy back. Ideally, you want to aim for a 1-to-1 ratio of troops in your first line to troops in your second line. As you can see from this example, that's not always possible because I've only got 3 units. So it's up to you what formations you put your units in and how many you keep back as a reserve. Now we get to the nitty-gritty of battle, how to win and how to gain ground and push your opponent back. Now the obvious way is to kill your opponents, and that's fine. But remember that in most scenarios, the enemy are going to have access to roughly the same weapons as you, and probably about the same numbers as well. You're not going to be able to have the edge to outshoot the enemy, so you have to outmaneuver them instead. Now the best way to do this is using compulsory moves. As those of you who've played the game will know, each morale distance, indicated by the colour token, has an associated fallback zone with it. For example, the blue tokens, it's 5 centimetres. For the yellow tokens, it's 10 centimetres. Now at the start of the turn, if you have any enemy units inside your fallback zone, you're going to have to make a compulsory move backwards and forfeit your turn. There's no dice rolls, no morale checks. They will automatically be driven back and lose their turn, and it's the easiest way to win line of battle. In reality, it's how battles actually happened. Only rarely at the end of a battle would a unit throw down all its weapons and flee the battlefield in terror. What would normally happen is that one side, once it started to lose the firefight and lose that fire superiority, would refuse to advance or start to edge backwards despite their officers trying to keep them in line. That's the situation you want to be in. Of course, the way to make sure you're a higher morale level than your enemy is to have those reserves in the back, because otherwise they're going to be the ones pushing you back. That's why you always need fresh units on hand to check a retreat and to push the enemy back. So going back to this example here, let's just imagine that we've managed to outshoot these Austrians. Now they've got quite a lot of hits, and they've got the same number of hits as us. So the easiest way to do it, if we get these down to orange. Now the fallback zone for that is 15 centimetres. So that means, in this case, we could then just move in a fresh unit like this. And at the start of the following turn, these 3 units will automatically have to retreat, which gives your artillery another chance to shoot at them, it gives your infantry a chance to move up and to rest, and your cavalry can keep them running and get them off the battlefield. That's the best way to win. Now that brings us nicely onto cavalry tactics. Cavalry are fantastic shock troops. They tend to roll double or sometimes even quadruple dice when they go into a melee, which means they've got a lot of killing power, and we'll come on to that later. But here I'm going to look at a pursuit, which is what we just did over here. That's why your infantry divisions always need cavalry support, because cavalry are the best troops to chase off an enemy brigade. So let's carry on with that scenario from a minute ago and assume everything's gone well. We've outshot the enemy line and they're backing off, so we need to follow up and stay close so as not to give them time to recover, and they'll keep retreating next turn. The important thing to remember is that infantry, even when they're in column, which is the fastest they can move, even if they're doubling, will only move 6 centimetres. The enemy units, if they have a token and make a compulsory move, will automatically back off 5 centimetres in each turn. So it's only just possible for you to keep up with them and keep them running. That's what your cavalry are perfect for. Because they can move 10 centimetres a turn, they're the ideal troops to charge in, keep close to the enemy, and stop them from having a chance to regroup. You don't need to melee, however tempting it might seem, because that will disrupt your troops just as much as it is the enemy. Just stay close to ensure that they'll always be inside the fallback zone, and they will just keep running and running. And I've had games where my units have been kept running like this across the entire board and ended up surrendering when they get to the edge. That's what a skillful general would have aimed to do back in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and it's what you'll need to do to win line of battle. A quick word on what this mechanism represents. This doesn't mean that your troops are literally inching forwards, scaring off the enemy just because you're not making any melee charges or rolling any dice. Imagine what these cavalry are doing is they're making rushes on isolated, scattered enemy troops, picking off stragglers, and generally making a nuisance of themselves, preventing these troops from recovering and regrouping. A few determined enemy rearguard troops might be firing the odd volley at your cavalry. It's just because it's not a grand brigade level cavalry charge, it's not worth rolling any dice for. That sort of thing happens quite a lot in this game. You'll gloss over a lot of the tactical level action in favour of big battlefield-wide decisions. Now, I did promise we would touch on melee tactics, so let's do that now. Melees can be really powerful, particularly if you're using specialist melee troops like heavy cavalry. You can wind up rolling a huge handful of attack dice and killing or scattering swathes of enemy troops, which does make it really tempting. And if you get it right, it can really swing the course of a battle for you. But what you've got to remember is that usually both sides' morale will suffer as badly as the other. Even if one side decisively wins the combat and ends up killing a lot of troops, their morale level will still go down, because morale doesn't just represent courage, it represents order and cohesion, and obviously being in a melee is going to affect your order and cohesion quite badly. So when you start a melee, both sides' morale level will automatically drop 1. When you attack, you'll drop again, and remember, even if you win, you'll still have to take a morale check at the end of the turn, which you might fail. So the best way to think of it is once you have a melee unit which has charged an enemy, write off that unit for a couple of turns, because by the end of the combat, both it and its opponent is going to be at orange at the very best, which means that they're not going to be any closer than 15 centimetres to an enemy unit. So it's going to take them a couple of turns to recover, to build back their order, cohesion, rest a little bit, gather the stragglers together. Again, this is based on reality. You're talking about a couple of thousand soldiers here charging into an enemy unit. It's going to take time to get them back together again. So the lesson is, just like the infantry tactics we saw earlier, always have reserve. If you just attacked with this cavalry unit, yeah, you'd probably smash this brigade, but then these guys wouldn't be able to follow up on anything, and these would have a chance to recover. Whereas if you had another cavalry unit just behind them, or an infantry unit in support, that would mean the fresh unit would start driving back the scattered enemy at the end of the turn. And again, that's how you win the game. You're driving back the enemy, you're capturing ground. So let's look at a little bit more of a detailed example of how those compulsory moves at distances work. So what we've got here is our cavalry unit has charged an enemy infantry unit, and they've won, which is not that unusual, given that our cavalry are equipped with melee weapons and they get extra dice when they charge as well. So what's happened is they've inflicted 3 casualties on the enemy, so they're down to 1 hit left, and they've gone to a red morale token, which means they're broken, and next turn they're going to start retreating. But as you can see, it's been quite costly for us as well. We've taken 2 hits, and we've also got an orange token. We're not quite as bad as the broken enemy unit, but we're still in a pretty bad way. As soon as we get to within 15 centimetres of an enemy unit that's fresh, we're going to start retreating ourselves. So these guys at the moment are in no fit state to be chasing down the enemy. They might be able to do it for a turn or two, but pretty soon they're going to come up against some enemy reserves, and then it's us who's going to be retreating. Now this is exactly the same situation, but with reserves. So we've got the enemy unit here, our cavalry here, but we've also got an infantry unit in reserve over here. So what that means is as soon as the turn ends, the enemy will start retreating. So they'll go back. Normally it would be 10 centimetres, but for the purpose of this demonstration we'll just edge them back. Now because we've got some fresh units over here, they're going to keep driving these enemy back off the edge of the screen and towards their own board edge. These guys don't need to bother chasing them because they've got fresh troops to do it for them. So that means these can pull back, rest, regroup and get ready for the next charge. And that's really the sort of tactics that you want to be using in line of battle, using melee sparingly, only when you've got overwhelming numbers and superiority, and most of the time just be driving your opponent back using those compulsory moves. And finally, that brings us to artillery tactics. Unlike what I've just said about morale and timing being critical for infantry and cavalry, guns really are just your killing machines. Just like real life, artillery are probably going to be causing the majority of your kills in 18th and 19th century battles. The main tactical question you're going to have to deal with is what are you going to shoot at? Fighting troops or the enemy's artillery? Shooting artillery in the days before exploding shells is a very tricky business, so compared to firing at massed blocks of infantry, firing at a couple of men sort of scattered around a gun is going to be a very chancy shot at 1500 yards. So for that reason, artillery are always a hit with a negative modifier. In practice, combined with the fact that they're normally quite far away, means that you're usually looking at a 6 to hit. Remember that artillery roll extra dice as the enemy get closer, so that's 2 dice per stand at effective range and 3 at close range. So although it might be quite tempting to knock out the enemy artillery and give you dominance of the battlefield, it's usually more productive to be firing at close range at enemy infantry and cavalry units when their targets present themselves. And also remember that artillery needs to be properly sighted. It takes a whole turn to rotate guns and 2 turns to redeployment. So you've got 1 to move and another to unlimber. So you're going to need to make sure that that 90-degree firing arc covers not only where the enemy are, but also where they're going to be. It's a good idea to make sure you've got something handy to protect your guns. Remember, if they get charged, they get taken off the board straight away. So it's a quick way to lose 3 or 4 stands in one go. An infantry or a cavalry unit in the rear will just help protect them from any marauding bands of light cavalry that have an idea about taking your guns out. For infantry, you need to be constantly thinking about what formation you're in and what formation you want to be in a couple of turns' time. Do you want to be picking through bad terrain or moving quickly? Then choose column. If you're firing, make sure you're in line, and I would say aim to have half your brigades in reserve out of range of the enemy guns so that you can move those morale tokens around using your push in reserves ability. Cavalry are really powerful shock troops. They can move across the battlefield very, very quickly. But just remember that even a victorious cavalry charge is going to disorder your troops just as much as those of the enemy. So keep some reserves back and always be thinking, is it worth charging or is it worth just moving close and driving back an enemy who's on a lower morale level? Use those compulsory moves to defeat your enemy rather than melees. And finally, your heavy artillery. So correct positioning is crucial here. Make sure your guns can cover any eventuality no matter what the enemy are going to do, ideally without having to redeploy, and then they can just sit back and rack the kills up. And there you have it, an introduction to the basic tactics you'll need to be using to win games of line of battle. We've covered infantry, cavalry and artillery tactics, and looked at formations and using morale distances to drive your opponent back. In future videos we'll be looking at some more in-depth tactics and using special units to best effect, so watch out for those. Okay, thanks for watching and good luck!